Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be speaking today about NFV and the control plane. And I wanted to talk about some of the new business models that are possible and that are enabled through virtualization of the control plane. So just to get started, when we talk about the control plane, I just wanted to kind of set the context of what we're talking about. We're talking about the applications that reside in the control plane in the network. So things like policy servers, subscriber management, online charging. Those are the types of applications that sit really above the data plane in the control plane of the network. And so I think that's an important distinction because when we look at virtualization as a whole and we look at trends around NFV, certainly what we see is that some of the first components that will move to be deployed in a virtualized mode are those that sit in the control plane. So that's really the focus of what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes. If you look at some recent research from Heavy Reading, you'll see that among the operator community, there's very strong support for virtualization of policy as an application. In fact, if you look at which functions they think will be virtualized first in the network, policy comes at the top of the list with more than 50% of operators viewing that as one of the first components that will be virtualized. What's interesting, though, if we move on to the second part of the research was when operators were surveyed around what benefits they saw that they would achieve through virtualization, service agility really came towards the bottom of the list. So only 15% of the operators that were surveyed recognized the service agility benefits that would come with virtualization. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So if you look at the drivers for virtualization as a whole, obviously there's the standard CapEx, OpEx reduction, and that really drives a lot of the investments that we're seeing around virtualization in the network. So operators are looking at how they improve the overall cost of ownership. There's a driver to separate the software from the hardware to achieve some benefits in terms of faster cycles, in terms of delivering new software into the network and eliminating some of the hardware development cycles. And there's also the scalability aspects, which are pretty well known in terms of virtualization and what can be achieved when you have the ability to scale resources according to the demands of your network, and you can scale resources much more quickly in a virtualized mode. But the last box here in green is the one I want to talk about, which is the whole benefit around increasing service agility and velocity. So having the ability to deploy new services quickly through virtualization, which we see as one of the key benefits that people really aren't talking about as much today, and really focused on the CapEx, OpEx piece of virtualization. So if we look at how virtualization and NFV as a strategy drives enhanced service agility, there's really three key components that we look at. The first is accelerating the launch of new services. So as operators are looking at deploying new types of services, having a virtualized environment means that they can streamline the installation and rollout activities. Support for new applications, support for new regions, services in different regions, those types of things, and faster deployment of the applications that support service rollout as well. And that's a key driver. Supporting new business models, we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail, but business models around MVNOs, so supporting MVNO, enterprise, public safety deployments, so virtual deployments for the public safety market, as well as supporting some of the key features that are needed in an enterprise environment, support for delegated administration and multi-tenancy. Those things come naturally with virtualization and aren't things that we see as commonly today with deployments. And then the last piece of the drivers around service agility is really focused on targeting service introduction based on different regions. So being able to take some of the data from the network and use that data to target the requirements and the services around different regions and what's needed to support services in those regions. And you get that benefit because you can move resources around in a virtualized environment that you don't have when you have a standard bare metal deployment. You can also rapidly scale up or scale down services and move the resources to support those services. So those are three of the ways that we see virtualization driving enhanced service agility. If we look at a couple of the business models that we see in terms of NFV and what it supports, really I'm going to profile three for you. The first is around extending applications. So what we can do in a virtualized mode to extend applications out to different operating companies and using different services and profiling those services out to different parts of the network. The second is around enterprise and M2M. So looking at the enterprise business model and the demands for supporting M2M across the network. And the last one is public safety. We're seeing increased requirements around the public safety market, specifically looking at how you can have dedicated quality of service in certain areas based on certain issues that may be happening if there's an emergency, being able to reallocate resources accordingly. So these are three of the use cases that we see as key in terms of virtualization supporting from a control plane perspective. So let's start with the first one, extending applications. So in this case, we're talking about a Galaxy operator, so an operator that has multiple regional properties. They're investing in a core data infrastructure to roll out VoLTE and RCS services. And it's expensive to replicate those services across the different properties. So actually taking the infrastructure across each of the properties and deploying it is prohibitive from a cost perspective. So what the opportunity here that's possible with virtualization is to actually extend a centralized deployment of LTE, VoLTE, and RCS to the different regional properties. So you extend that from one central control plane. So taking a virtualized control plane, extending it out, and enabling those regional operators to have local data plane elements. So you immediately are retaining control of the application level management of the control plane centrally, and there's no prerequisites in terms of having certain levels of subscribers to support the business model for those different use cases. So what are the benefits here? Well, first of all, you get service differentiation in the local market. So you can support a broader range of services out to the end subscriber by supporting them centrally, deploying it once and then out to these different markets. You can localize the services. So in a virtualized model, you can take that common footprint and you can then localize those services to enable you to match or meet the demands in the different regions. And the other benefit for the operators and the regional operators is they can share the cost of maintaining the applications. And this is really key. This goes back to some of the earlier benefits I mentioned. You know, when you look at the CapEx and OpEx benefits, so not only are they able to achieve new service delivery out to their customers, new services, but they also experience some of those CapEx and OpEx benefits because they're sharing the overall cost of maintaining applications. So this is what we see as one of the key use cases when operators are looking at control plane virtualization, is having the ability in large Galaxy types of operators to extend those applications out to different properties. The second use case I mentioned was around enterprise services. So when we look at the requirements from enterprise, there's typically heavy requirements around security, VPN requirements, and we see different departments requiring differing levels of access and different quality of service. So these are key characteristics of an enterprise deployment. And so when we look at that and we look at what's possible through virtualization, there's the ability to create private networks through partitioning. So this is really key because it enables the operators to meet the security, the access, the privacy needs of different enterprise verticals. And not only meeting those needs of the verticals themselves, but of the different departments within each of those enterprises as well. And delegated administration comes in here where it's very important that the actual enterprise administrator has the ability to manage those security, quality of service, privacy, all those different aspects within the enterprise. So within the virtualized control plane, what enables this is really having the ability to define different policies against different roles. So understanding the role of the users in the enterprise and providing them with the access, the quality of service, and the parameters and service descriptions that are relevant to their role in that organization. You get the value add through delegated administration, so you can centrally manage users, adding, deleting, managing different access and usage as well. So those are key benefits to the enterprise in terms of giving them control over their environment. And from a service provider perspective, deploying this type of virtualized solution out to the enterprise, the benefits are really around being able to scale, provide, meet the enterprise needs at a lower cost, and to provide better performance and scale without having to add hardware or software. And I think this is important as well. It's back to supporting a new business model, giving enterprises what they need, but not having to deploy dedicated hardware for each of the different enterprise customers. So that's the second use case around enterprise services and what's possible with virtualization. The third use case relates to public safety. And what we're seeing, and some of this was driven, certainly through some of the events in the U.S. over the past 10 years, we're seeing a lot of focus from actual regional municipalities and different government organizations on actually deploying private LTE networks. So looking at how they can have a dedicated LTE network to service their emergency services communications. And what public safety agencies are looking at now is they're actually looking for ways they can share the radio access with other agencies, but having their own access network and their own, their own packet core network and their own control plane to manage services on that network. So the opportunity here is really to enable these public safety agencies to benefit from a commercial model and from a commercial perspective in terms of being able to share the radio access across different agencies, and also to give them a hybrid model whereby they can manage and control their own virtualized core network. So being able to support that in a virtualized mode gives them clearly cost benefits in terms of how they manage it, but also capabilities to extend their overall footprint in terms of the region they manage. How it works in terms of virtualized control plane in this case is that you have the virtualized network instances running in a centralized platform, and given that emergencies when they happen tend to be unpredictable, you have the ability to actually scale up and scale down resources as needed, but also to provide dedicated quality of service for given emergencies in given regions. So you can actually specify which parts of your network you need to deliver at a certain quality of service, and reallocate resources if there's actually a shift or there's an emergency that happens in a certain region. So in this case, it's very much a case of being able to scale up and scale down resources and that benefit that virtualization gives you to address the public safety requirements for the public safety market. So I see this as well as another key use case that's being deployed quite widely today, utilizing virtualization of the control plane elements. So when we talk about virtualization, we're really on a path to virtualization, and when we look at considerations for operators that are looking to deploy virtualized solutions and certainly elements of the control plane, there's really 5 key things that we look at in terms of key considerations. So being able to adopt a framework based on changing technology and commercial needs. So we see a lot of movement in the industry around the hypervisors that are being used to deploy virtualized applications and being flexible in terms of approach to support the evolution of some of that technology. From an operator's perspective, there's a lot of changes that are required to support virtualization, and we see that in terms of organizations shifting. So we see in terms of the operator community, them embracing virtualization, but also looking at what it means from an organizational perspective, not just in the network and the control plane, but more broadly, looking at the changes that are required around OSS systems, for example, and how they're going to orchestrate and manage their virtualized environments. So it's not just a question of the technology, it's really a question of having the back-end operation and organization in place to support virtualization. The lead applications is another consideration, so being able to identify which are the best suited applications to virtualize. So this goes back to what I talked about in the research at the start of the presentation, which is really looking at what are the applications that will move to be virtualized first. What's the business benefit, the return on investment for virtualizing those elements, and can that be supported from an operational perspective inside the operator community? So that's key as well. Vendor roadmaps. Again, we feel as a vendor a lot of pressure from operators to provide a clear path to virtualization, where we're going, how we're going to get there, how that path then leads on to NFV and SDN and evolves as we go forward. And then finally, the last one is what I talked about earlier, identifying different service opportunities. So how virtualization can enable service differentiation, new service use cases and opportunities, and really look at how you can generate revenue from virtualization as opposed to just looking at the CapEx, OpEx benefits as justifying the investment in virtualization. And I think that's really key. And so finally, just to close, I mentioned that this is really a journey. So we see virtualization as a step on the journey to full SDN and NFV. So where operators are today, virtualized appliances being deployed in operators' data centers, this is very much here and now, with a focus on that OpEx and CapEx reduction, and some discussion of the service business models and the new business models, but a very small percentage. That's just starting to grow. As we move forward 12 to 18 months, I think we'll see more cloud-aware and NFV compliant solutions. Obviously, the vendor community and the operator community is very actively engaged in the work that's going on with ETSI at the moment, and so we'll see some evolution of that over the next 12 months. I think we'll see more NFV-compliant applications, further reduction, enhanced elasticity, and that will really take us to the last piece, which is monetizing the SDN and NFV networks. So then we're looking at real-time analytics and orchestration and all the components that come with that to look at monetization. So that really summarizes, from our perspective, what we see happening around virtualization specific to the control plane and specific to how it enhances service agility. So I think there's time for questions.